Life's a funny thing. Some of us are dealt some pretty cruddy cards, and then we're expected to just grow up. Normal. That leaves a lot of us to struggle as we navigate through life's difficult times. And if you're anything like me, you have no idea what the hell normal is. Welcome to the Wishbone Podcast with me, your host, Kaua'i, as we discuss and share our life stories in hopes of helping each other out. So if you got 30 minutes, let's talk about it. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Wishbone Podcast. I'm your host, Luca. Today we got kind of a cool episode where I'm going to be talking about communication, the funny parts of communicating, or rather misunderstanding, and kind of the more serious notes when it comes to misunderstanding. So last week's Gray Matters question, Matters of the Gray, was what is one misunderstanding that you look back on now that was so profound it's pretty funny? And I have a pretty good one. We're going to start in the middle of the story, and then I'll kind of give some backlight to it. But essentially, I come home, and my dad's pissed at me. Not surprisingly necessarily, but it was surprising as to what he was upset about, right? So I come home, and he says something to the like of, "You think you're better than me? Pack your shit." And I was like, "Oh my gosh! Like, what could he possibly be upset about?" And so as we're talking and I'm nervous and he's asking me questions, and of course I'm just giving him real quick one-word answers, I'm starting to put together that he's upset about Steve Irwin, right? And so this is kind of the humorous part, but Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, was super influential to me at the time. I used to watch him on TV. And I did wish that he was a father to me. The guy was passionate, loving, caring, patient, everything that you want in a father figure. And he taught me a lot of stuff. My lizard catching technique is from him. The way I say Python is from him. I don't intentionally mean to say Python. I just say Python as opposed to Python or Python. The way I catch snakes and kind of definitely portray this calm state to translate into the snake is definitely from him. I named my oldest son after him. He was just very influential. So here I am thinking that he is so mad at me because I'm looking up to this guy, wanting him to be my dad. I hadn't told anybody this, but he had found my secret out, right? And so he was pissed off that I wanted Steve Irwin to be my dad, which is so funny. And as he's talking to me and yelling at me and screaming and all this kind of stuff, I can tell that he's hurt, but I can start to piece together what he's actually upset about. And at one point, he's like, "You and your girlfriend can fuck off and live your own life." And it finally started to come clear to me, but he was upset, I think, about a comment I had made to my mom. And so the backstory to this is, I was dating this girl at the time. Her name's Nicole. Wonderful person. Great, salt-of-the-earth human being. If she ever listens to this, Nicole, hi, you're incredible. Great job at putting up with my crap. And, you just turned out to be a wonderful human being. So, anyway, her mom was involved in a really serious car accident. So much so that I think it was a drunk driver, had hit a second car. That second car had spun out and hit her mom's Expedition, a huge vehicle. Sent the Expedition off into a kind of a spin. They were at a red light, right? And they weren't in motion, and it sent them into motion. So it pushed them into a street lamp. The street lamp fell and crushed the Expedition. She ended up breaking her sternum. It was a really horrible accident. The driver who caused the accident was drunk and died. But anyway, I told my mom at the time that, her mom is so rich that they damaged and totaled this Expedition, huge vehicle, and they got a new one, brand new. Now, obviously, I was ignorant to how insurance worked, but anyway, I had made this comment, and she had told my dad, and I think my dad just took it sideways and was thinking like, "Oh, Luca thinks that this family is richer and better than we are." They were more well off than we were, but I didn't think they were better than us. And so he took it the way he took it and came at me and was, kicking me. I don't know what happened as far as if I did end up leaving the house for a week or two. I don't recall, but it was leading up to the time period where I was kicked out. So it was near that time period. And so I look back on it and I find it very funny. Like that degree of misunderstanding led to a grown man kicking his young son down and out. And when really it was just a misunderstanding. Like, I don't think if I would have sit my dad down and be like, Dad, here's a scenario. Can you believe that they're well off, that they just bought a new car, that he'd be upset. Of course, he'd be like, you're a dumbass. It's insurance. But I don't think he'd be upset. Now, if we were to take a step back and if I told him about Steve Irwin, I honestly feel like he'd be upset because I do think his feelings were hurt. And looking back on it now, trying to look at it through objective lenses, I think he was feeling replaced and dethroned and was feeling upset. So there's one misunderstanding that I look back and I think it's humorous. While tragic, I do think it's something that I've, was able to work through and find humorous. Now, misunderstandings can be funny and they can be intentionally funny, right? So here's a scenario where my oldest son, who has always been a trickster, I call him Kaua'i. Kaua'i in Hawaiian means troublemaker. We have an outdoor shower, or at least at the time we had an outdoor shower, and I noticed that one of these screws was loose, and I was just going to hurry and screw it in real quick with my Leatherman. And I've been carrying a Leatherman for years and years and years, thanks to my best friend, Uncle Mike. The best piece of advice anyone's ever given me. The thing has been a lifesaver. So I always carry Leatherman. I've got about 6 or 7 different Leathermans now, different models, and they're amazing. So I remember my son was like 3 or 4. He was barely putting together full sentences, communicated great, but just, at that age, you just don't put together a bunch of full sentences. So I remember asking him, hey, can you please give me my silver multi-tool? And he's like, oh, your silver flashlight. And I was like, oh, that's weird. No, not my flashlight, son, my multi-tool, my pliers. And he's like, oh, yeah, your flashlight. And I was like, oh, man, how am I not communicating this clearly enough to this kid? So I'm like, no, Ernie, you know the silver thing that I carry with me at all times? And I'm sure I said that has a knife on or whatever. And he kept saying stuff like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. The flashlight. And I was like, oh my gosh, kid, what are you talking about, flashlight? And I finally swing open the shower curtain. I'm like, son, the Leatherman. And he's like stifling back his laughter. Like he's against the wall and he's just holding his mouth and he's laughing so hard. And I finally realized I got, right? And he is taking me for a loop and it worked. So that misunderstanding definitely was intentionally supposed to be funny. And the reason I bring up these two different scenarios is because they are from two very different perspectives, right? So my dad, the adult in the situation, his first go-to reaction is to get frustrated, pissed off. He works himself up even more, amps himself up, and it just blows up. That's the example that I've learned and actually have adopted and expressed a lot of the time. Even nowadays, I have a very hard time if I get into this state of mind where I can't calm myself down. It's a bullshit answer. I get it. Total excuse. But I find myself just working myself up. Now, ideally, I would de-escalate the situation and kind of stay calm and work through the scenario. But, so my dad definitely does that. And he has a very hard time being calm and kind of saying de-escalating things. He's the type of guy, or was the type of guy, that would say things just to irk you on. And he kind of gets lost in that momentum that he's already started, and it just builds and builds. And then there was the time with my son where I could have easily been like, what are you talking about? I said my Leatherman, getting very frustrated. But it's my son. Like, I love him to death. So I was able to stay calm in that scenario and realize just how quickly of a funny scenario that was. And my son is going to remember that as a positive experience, I hope. He'll remember that I got the old man. I got him to really believe what I was putting out there. And he feels comfortable enough to actually do that to me, right? I never would feel comfortable, even nowadays, to do that to my own dad. Like, it's very far out of my comfort zone to think that I could trick my dad, make a fool of him without him getting upset, where, please, make me the fool in any scenario when it comes to me and my boys. I don't care. I think it's hilarious. And if we can laugh, it's well worth it. So it is very interesting to see different perspectives and different approaches to misunderstandings, and just how your reaction to things can really make that a positive or negative experience. This type of communication takes time. Some of us are have these tools innate in us. They're built into us, and we're able to exercise them much as you would a muscle. And they're very strong, very robust for positive, strong communicators. Someone like me who works very diligently to communicate in a positive fashion, it takes time. And when I tell you it takes time, the amount of energy I spend on a daily basis to make sure that the words I'm saying, the facial expressions I'm giving out, even my body language is conducive to a positive communication is exhausting. It's a lot of energy. I mean, like I said, I have resting dick face. My RDF is strong, and if I don't catch it, I feel like I give off this impression that I'm pissed off, I'm mad. And again, what's going on in my head is completely the opposite. You know, you have that Dave Chappelle skit, just crazy things going on in my head, have nothing to do with me being mad. So I definitely do try at this, and it's taken time. There was an incident where I had with my sister. We were arguing, as many siblings do. But because we both communicated in the same way. We just both kept escalating and escalating. Got to the point where she started to choke herself, and she's like, I'm just going to kill myself. And my reaction was not something I would do now. Obviously, what I would do now is de-escalate, give a hug, show love, talk it through, let them know that I'm here for them and we can work through it. And there's just so many things I wish I could have done as a kid, and had these tools at my disposal. But what I did was like, go ahead, do it. You're just going to pass out anyway. Thinking, you know, I don't know what I was thinking, but it was a tool bag that I reached into and pulled out a hammer is really what happened. So it wasn't a very productive conversation. And it's those conversations where I look back and I kind of, I reflect on those outcomes, and I wish I could have changed it. Now, I touched on it last week. Regret is one of the worst things you can have. It's a toxin that is part of life, and it's one of those things that you need to have, in my opinion. It's something you should try to limit, but regret is just part of life. And I wish I could have gone back and changed things. So to make some sort of meaning out of this suffering of me just wishing I could have changed things, I'm going to change how I approach things now, stepping forward, right? So I do approach scenarios where miscommunication is a worry or possibility with a lot more clarity and a lot more effort. And then when I find myself in miscommunication, where I find myself getting really angst and upset, I definitely have more options now where I'm like, you're getting upset, you can choose to step back, you can choose to hold your ground, but I typically don't escalate it to the point where I'm like, you want to go, you want to fight. Those days I feel are further and further behind me, and those instances are fewer and fewer. It's definitely in me. I have this anger, this Hulk side of me that's kind of always underneath the surface, but it's easier to ignore that side or to overlook that side, which I find to be a success, right? So one thing I do notice that is very easy to do is to be negative, pessimistic, and while I am the ultimate optimist in my mind, I do find myself leaning into that negativity. And so one thing I've been working on lately is to really kind of steer into the positive side, something I don't necessarily always do, but I want to. I want that to be kind of my knee-jerk reaction as well. What if the positive outcome? So very interesting. We'll move on a little bit in the show. Next week, I hope to have a very important guest on the show. It's my cousin Kayla. Very amazing person. She has had a very hard upbringing, and she is very open with her trials and tribulations and the things that she's going through. She is seeking professional help, and it's been amazing talking to her. A little bit of backstory. Kayla was the cousin that just was always getting mistreated. My dad always had an answer for it, and that her mom just didn't bond with her, didn't have the serotonin release. These are things he's saying to me, so these are things I just remember, but she didn't have the serotonin release during breastfeeding, whatever the case is, and so they never bonded. If that is true, it was very evident how she treated Kayla. If it's not true, there was other reasons that led to her kind of singling out Kayla. Now, she mistreated all her kids, let's be fair and honest about it, but Kayla really was like under the microscope when it came to my Aunt Leslie's abuse. And so she survived this abuse. Now she's still dealing with trauma and the pains and sores and scars that were inflicted on her. And unfortunately, she isn't as progressed in her trauma recovery as she'd like. But I'm very excited to have her on the show. We're definitely going to talk about what she remembers growing up, what she recalls of the abuse. Now, she was quite young when she was, quote unquote, rescued from the abuse, but she tells a very harrowing story of abuse. And it's just amazing. Again, it's one of those miracles I talked about earlier in the podcast where you can abuse somebody or an animal to the point that they should not be able to recover. And here she is kind of in defiance of that, saying that I am going to recover. I am going to be this positive influence. And supposedly she's going to start her own podcast to share her story. And I freaking would love to kind of portray that on the episode, on the podcast, to kind of highlight that victims can take control of their trauma and actually use it for good, which would be a very, very cool thing to come out of this kind of negative story. So speaking of trauma and hopefully producing some positive out of it, I want to kind of showcase the dichotomy between me and my sister Nicole. So you guys kind of know already a lot about my abuse. We were sexually molested as children, and while I never really took it as I was a victim of the scenario, I definitely see the after effects of that for sure. I'm not saying there weren't any, but what I'm saying is the few times that I felt negative toward the abuse was always in the context that my sister was suffering. I never took it as I was suffering from it. I do remember a couple times of this 16, 18-year-old person being on top of me and doing whatever they did and then leaving the mess behind, if you can catch my drift. There was more than the 2 times that I can recall. I do know that there, but I just don't remember them very well. They're very hazy. Whereas my sister remembers every scenario. Apparently they might have even tied her up a little bit, which she fought and struggled against. But it's very difficult to hear her recount the stories because she suffers so much when she recounts it. She used to wake me up, like I've mentioned before, in the middle of the night asking for me to help her kill herself because she just couldn't. When she slept, she dreamt of it or had nightmares about it. When she was awake, she was constantly thinking of it. And that, to me, was like the true trauma or the true negative of our experience is seeing her go through it. And so, yes, I was molested, but I never really had negative issues with it. Now, my sister did, and so it would be interesting to see if she's able to somehow pull through this abuse and this trauma and tell her story. I think she would be an amazing role model to exemplify what it means to struggle and to struggle hard and to come out of it on the other side still intact with some bits of humanity. My sister, like I've mentioned, I don't know if she can ever experience a true rock bottom. She's a prostitute or has been a prostitute. She's a hardcore drug user. She's transgender. I mean, each one of these topics would be very difficult alone, and she's dealing with a lot of these together. She's been sexually assaulted, and it's very difficult for me to talk about because I don't want it to come across that I'm using her story in any other way than to benefit her, right? So I wish she was here with me. I wish we could talk about it. I wish we could actually have a conversation where it was productive. Lately, what I've discovered is the few times that we have talked, it's always interlaced with these bits or fits, rather, of drug-induced hallucinations. And so we have these conversations where she just veers far right, and she's like, well, you came and you stole my money from me last year. I'm like, baby, I haven't seen you in like 20 years, you know? And so it's difficult that way because then she shows very, very real aggression, like, give me my money, like, you owe me my money. Or, you know, you came to my house and you punched me in the face, as she did with my dad. And that never happened. And so it's very difficult to have these real conversations. And so I really wish that we could have these face-to-face conversations where she could talk about her trauma and actually be an example of what it is to suffer to the degree that this person has suffered and still make it out. Now, I do hold high hopes that she does eventually come through this, but even recent news states that she's still using, and you know, I don't know what to say other than I hope she's able to find some sort of solace in her recovery. But when it comes to communicating, it's like I said earlier, it's a muscle. It's something you got to work out. And I remember, speaking of Nicole, my ex-girlfriend at the time, she was one of the first people that I actually shared my molestation with. And the sad news is, you know, like everyone else, you tell 1 out of 2 people, 1 out of every 3 people, depending on where you are in the country, they also have experienced some sort of sexual assault. And so while I had up to that point been very communicative with it, like, oh, I was molested as a kid, when it came to her, maybe I was feeling more vulnerable, maybe more open. It was very hard for me to open up to her. And when I told her, I was mad. Not anything she had said or done, it was just the way I was able to get it out. I was very mad. And of course, my anger was misplaced, and it was directed at her. I found it very interesting that we have these times in our life where you don't think you're angry about something and it comes off angry, it's misdirected, whatever the case is. And I think that's where you need to really tap in and find out why you're upset. Obviously, you're going to be dealing with some reactions that you need to work through. There's other times where, unbeknownst to you, you're going to start to experience certain things. And what I mean by that is, I was never afraid of the dark. You know, definitely by the time I was 16, I wasn't afraid of the dark. But at 20, I was terrified of the dark. There was like a 6-month period of time where I just had to have every light in the house that I passed by in our house. And as I start to think about it, break it down, I was thinking that my father was going to be at the end of this hallway ready for me. And I would hear his like grunt, his like sound as if he were to grab me, right? And it wasn't necessarily I was afraid of him. At the time, I was confident in my physical abilities that I would be able to at least fight the guy off. But it was tapping into some sort of trauma, right? And it was triggering this little kid. And at 20, I was terrified of the dark. And so as I worked my way through this, it was a surprise to me that all of a sudden I was afraid of the dark. And I realized I was working through things that I'd been pushing off. And as I worked through it and realized I was very upset with my father, I missed him, I wanted him to be my dad, but we weren't the type of relationship, that's when the type of healing happened. And I wasn't necessarily trying to work through those things, right? But it manifested itself in the fear of dark. And I worked my way through it, and I all of a sudden was fine with the dark. One day, I think my ex-wife at the time, my wife at the time, shut the light off, and I used to freak. And she's like, oh, my bad, I'm so sorry. And I was like, no, let's actually leave it off. We're fine. And so, you know, your mind's ability to progress and process is amazing. And it really starts with communication, both internal and external. And really what I want to get across to you is that while I may be poor at communicating, and while you may be struggling with communicating, just keep at it. Just every day try to be better than yesterday. For me, I get to a certain point and I have a hard time repeating myself more than 4, 5, 6 times. And I realize now that if that's where my sticky point is, then I need to work on that. Maybe 9, 10, 11, 12 times is my goal, repeating myself or learning how to repeat myself or communicate in a way that doesn't have to be repeated. So we'll move on to the next segment, the last segment of the show, which is always the gray matters question, matters of the gray. So the question I have for you is, what's one incident where you reacted and it was almost innate? It wasn't anything you planned on. It wasn't anything that you thought you would react this way. You just reacted, and you and the person are both left after going, what the heck was that about? With that, I'll let you think about it, and we'll see you guys next week. Well, that's it, folks. Thanks for stopping by. Make sure to check out the show notes. As always, let's give them something to smile about, and we'll see you guys next week.